The election of 1992 saw a president in George Herbert Walker Bush who was immensely popular. He demonstrated that he was an excellent wartime leader, that he was a humanitarian, that he was a great diplomat, but many questioned his economic policies, and to make matters worse, over the course of 1992, the economy took a downturn as the effects of the Gulf War, the end of the Gulf War, and the recession that generally follows a war set in, as all of those servicemen and women in the National Guard returned back to their jobs, as the nation quit spending on the military. There was not totally stopped, but quit wartime level spendings on the military. There's a slight economic downturn. And so as the Democrats are deciding upon who to run, out of seeming nowhere comes the governor of Arkansas, a dark horse candidate, who with a dream team of advisors, James Carville and others, gave him a message that was able to sidetrack and defeat a popular sitting president. It's hard enough to beat an incumbent president, but to beat an incumbent president whose popularity at the start of the election year, 1992, was hovering in the high 80s, if not the low 90s, if not at 90, it was certainly in the 80s. Clinton's team came up with one excellent series of slogans, reminding the American people it's about the economy. Or to quote James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. Or read my lips, no new taxes. So reminding the American people that Bush had broke his promise. Now, the funny part of that is Clinton didn't go on and say, Bush broke his promise and raised your taxes once. I'm going to promise you, I'm just going to raise your taxes. But he was very targeted in his attack. And this dark horse candidate, seemingly out of nowhere, was able to beat the sitting president in a tight election, but nonetheless a decisive win for Bill Clinton. And so Bill Clinton, first Democrat in office in 12 years, puts together his advisors. And some of these advisors, it was a really tough fight to get them approved. Attorney General, he had nominated 2 people. Both of those people, as they were going before the Senate for confirmation, it was discovered that they were hiring illegal aliens and paying them under the table. So they were out. You don't want your top law enforcer, the Attorney General, to be committing a crime. And so Attorney General Janet Reno was selected as the attorney. She was the Attorney General of Florida, was selected as the top law enforcement officer. And then I've got to tell you my story. I was in the Las Vegas airport a few years ago. It was probably a decade ago now. But I was walking through the airport and came face to face with former Secretary of the State Warren Christopher. And he saw that I recognized him, so he approached me and I shook his hand and said hi to him and introduced myself and thanked him for his service. And he said, "Thanks for supporting us." And I said, "Well, sir, I hate to tell you, but I'm not a Democrat and I didn't vote for your administration and didn't particularly like your president, but I appreciate, and I didn't really even like your policies. But I appreciate that you were willing to serve and try to implement those policies." And he laughed and he said, I wish all of the opposition was as kind as you are, and we parted our separate ways. But that was my one brush with greatness. My one connection to the Clinton administration was meeting Warren Christopher in the airport. But as Clinton takes office, he's immediately beset by a number, almost a foreshadowing of things to come. On February 26, 1993, the nation was shocked by an act of terrorism in New York City at the World Trade Center. No, not September 11th. This was the first attack on the Trade Center, perpetuated by Osama bin Laden. Some called this a trial run, others that this was a very viable attempt. What he tried to do at lunchtime on a busy work day is with a Ryder moving van loaded with a fertilizer bomb, ammonium nitrate, and I think they had extra canisters of hydrogen or something. I'm not a chemist and I don't play one on TV, but they packed this truck with all these explosives and they parked it in Tower 1, near one side of Tower 1, and the idea was it explodes and they wanted to topple Tower 1 and make it fall over by destroying all the supports on that one side, made the tower collapse into Tower number 2, so that both towers then fall over into the other buildings surrounding and killing thousands. Well, the explosion went off, but it didn't have the effect that they desired. The tower was more resilient. 1,336 pounds of bomb exploded under Tower 1. 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured, but the building didn't collapse. And so as a warning sign, Osama bin Laden, who, by the way, during the Reagan years, Oliver North, in testimony to Congress, had warned the Congress about the dangers of Osama bin Laden and how they needed to look out for him, that he had it in for the United States. But his warning was ignored, as to the warnings of February 26, 1993 were ignored. And so the first act of terrorism of the Clinton administration was then shortly followed by what many considered a domestic act of terrorism. On February 28, 1993, the Bureau of Arms, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, was executing a search warrant and an arrest warrant on a ranch outside of Waco in the town of Elk at the Mount Carmel Center, which was the home of David Koresh, born David Vernon Howell. But David Koresh was a cult leader, and he and his followers were forted up in Mount Carmel. And based upon testimony of a UPS agent who had gone out to the compound to deliver a package, and this package apparently had fallen or was dropped, and when it was split open, it was illegal firearms being shipped through UPS. Well, he reported the incident. There were other complaints, and had been complaints of polygamy, of statutory rape. Koresh admitted to having multiple wives, of many young girls in the compound, ages 13 and 14, had children, which in Texas is statutory rape. And so the ATF on February 28 went out to execute these search warrants and arrest warrants for members of the cult. In executing the search warrants, it's unclear as to who fired first, but a firefight ensued between the Branch Davidians and the ATF, and 4 agents were killed and 6 Davidians were killed. The ATF then set up a perimeter around the Davidian compound and called for the Davidians to surrender. Now, in the process of what follows from February to April in the siege, the ATF hands off responsibility for the siege to the FBI, and the FBI and state troopers and National Guard will continue their perimeter around the compound, calling on the Davidians to give up. But in that process, Janet Reno is confirmed and takes over personal supervision of the siege and then ultimately the assault on the Branch Davidian compound. Using all forms of sleep deprivation, playing sounds, loud music, lights, they tried to negotiate and force the Davidians to give up. Despite the fact that everybody there appeared to be there willingly, and the contacts the Davidians had with the outside world, they didn't seem to be troublemakers, and they just wanted to live on their own and the world leave them alone. In following reports of what ensued, the FBI and the ATF totally mishandled this. Rather than seeing this as an apocalyptic cult, they prosecuted this as a hostage situation. Well, there weren't any hostages. And in fact, ultimately, with Bradley fighting vehicles circling around the perimeter and combat engineering vehicles plowing over the perimeter, the FBI would go out of their way to annoy the Davidians. Davidian cars that were parked, you can see some of them on the edge there. They would run over them with fighting vehicles and squash them. They would plow over gardens, just doing things to annoy and agitate. Even in one area there were marked graves, and the FBI would drive their vehicles over those graves, and repeatedly the Davidians informed them about the graves and asked them not to, and they continued to do it. The FBI, in the siege mentality, shut off the water, shut off the electricity, shut off the gas. Janet Reno finally approved on April 19th, or April 18th, she approved plans for April 19th for an assault on the compound. Now remember, they went here because there was illegal weaponry that they were told by another party, and that there were children in the compound. Now, some of those children were released. They were released with their mothers. Well, not released, they were allowed to leave. As soon as they were out of sight of the compound, the FBI separated the children from their mothers, arresting the mothers and sending the children into foster care. Well, people in contact with Koresh informed him of what went on, and they weren't about to trust the FBI after that. And I don't mean to sound sympathetic to the cult. I remember this taking place, and living where I do, David Koresh's mother lives in Chandler. I live in Brownsboro. I mean, there's a lot of connection there. And so this hit quite close to home. But the government appeared to be, the big hand of government appeared to be stomping or squeezing a cult that was minding their own business, that the government went out of the way to create an incident. Now, there are later reports, there are later lawsuits filed that seem to bear this out, and it seemed to be the case at the time, that government was irritated that anybody would tell them no. And so instead of just waiting and letting nature take its course, Janet Reno and the Clinton administration needed to show that they were tough on crime. And so April 19th, the assault comes on the compound. Because of the tear gases used, and because probably some of the Davidians set gasoline fires to try to destroy the attack vehicles, all of the Davidians were killed, even the children that were still in the compound, the women. The forensic examiners said, women died protecting their children. Some of the children showed stab wounds where the mothers killed their children to prevent them from burning to death. because they couldn't get out because the combat vehicles had crushed walls or ways that the cult would have been able to get out and surrender were now blocked, and they were burned to death in the fire. So a total mismanagement of the situation. Anyway, 76 Davidians died, so if you add the 6 originally killed, 82 died in all. Only 4 ATF agents were killed in the initial assault. But it gave the appearance that government was willing to do anything to crush its opposition. And in fact, the crisis, and the reason we're really talking about it, is it had legs. Now, I'm pulling this out of chronological order, but later in 1995, when Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blow up the Murrah Federal Building, they do it because of the attack on Waco and because of previous attacks on Ruby Ridge, Idaho, where a family, the ATF acting totally out of line, lays siege to a family, and in the assault on this family, kill the wife, kill one of the kids, who are just innocent bystanders. An assault because of a minor weapons charge against the homeowner. So Ruby Ridge and the government step in, crushing of what they thought was a Aryan Nation member and a militia member, the stomping on a religious sect, and I'm trying to portray this as McVeigh is viewing it, that the government is stifling all domestic opposition. Those who dare say no are being crushed by an oppressive government. And so to strike back, they prepare a bomb in a rented vehicle and drive it to the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City, and blow it up. And then they become the very evil that they were condemning. They kill 169 people, including little children in the daycare center in the federal building. And so they become the evil. Now, Timothy McVeigh was later, they were both caught within days of the attack, and Timothy McVeigh was executed for the crime. Nichols is serving life in prison. But nonetheless, domestic terrorism on the rise in opposition. Now, the president enjoys some successes from carrying over from the Bush administration in the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and I put both pictures here. You see the October 1992 picture with George Bush and the Mexican president and the Canadian Prime Minister and their representatives signing the initial NAFTA agreement. And then November 21st, 1993, Bill Clinton signing the final draft. NAFTA, whether it was a domestic success or a domestic failure, depends upon the politician, depends upon the year, and whether they want to take credit or they want to blame the opposition. But Bill Clinton agreed with it and thought it was a great idea at the time, so much so that he will shepherd it through Congress and create a EU-like trade zone in the Western Hemisphere so that the United States, Canada, and Mexico can economically compete. Also domestically, President Clinton is going to advocate an overhaul of the health care system. He will introduce the Health Security Act, which was immediately by radio shows and other media called Hillary Care, because President Clinton gave the First Lady responsibility for being the face person and selling this health care reform bill to Congress. So she was the head of the Health Care Task Force. And for the next year, September 22nd, 1993, you see President Clinton introducing it, holding up his copy. Through 1994, she's going to be the advocate. And you see Mrs. Clinton there before Congress testifying. The Democratic-controlled Congress, House and Senate, with a Democratic president, could have easily passed the bill. However, there were powerful interest groups and lobbies that opposed it. And even though they've now been vilified by the opposition, their arguments were still valid. In fact, it would be the Democrats who ultimately killed this bill, while blaming it on the Republicans. But if the Democrats had wanted to, they could have passed it. They could have overridden any filibuster, and they could have passed it, and it would have been law. But as Senator John Patrick Moynihan, Democrat, stated, and I quote, "There is no health care crisis. There is an insurance crisis. Anyone who thinks the Clinton health care plan can work in the real world or presently written isn't living in the real world." And so ultimately, the Clinton health care reform bill, the health care reform bill not passing, is going to be a huge blow to President Clinton's domestic policy. Now, it's not to say he didn't get a lot of bills passed, because he did. And you can read about them in your book, because it's a litany, just like the Great Society, just like FDR and the New Deal. It's program after program after program, micromanaging and dealing with certain little things. But in the big things, he doesn't get it through, and he needs something to distract the public's attention. And generally, when Bill Clinton got in political problems at home, he always turned to international affairs to distract. And in fact, that would be the case now. One last thing, though, before we leave healthcare. This turn, Hillary Clinton and even Bill Clinton were not considered liberal Democrats at the time. Bill Clinton was considered a moderate Democrat. But after this Healthcare Reform Act and the failure of Hillary Care, to borrow the term, Hillary Clinton was labeled a liberal Democrat. And her politics continued to go left. Ironically, later biographies have come out and insiders have said Hillary was never the driving force, although it was always labeled and she was the one attacked as the one pushing this health care bill, that Bill Clinton was really the force behind it. It was his idea, his purpose. He was the one driving it. He was the one shepherding it through. She was simply the face to sell it to the American people. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what insiders have said. But to distract from the failing health care plan, in April of 1993, President George Herbert Walker Bush was invited to Kuwait to celebrate the liberation of Kuwait and to be honored by Kuwait as being its savior. You can see him arriving there for a few days in Kuwait, April 14th to the 16th, 1993, to celebrate the victory of the Persian Gulf War. While there, a plot was uncovered of 17 people, 17 Iraqis and Kuwaitis, all members of Al-Qaeda, who had become involved in a plot to park a truck outside President Bush's hotel, blow it up, and kill Bush. So an assassination attempt on President George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, the plan was foiled, but Saddam Hussein was directly linked between Al-Qaeda and the assassination attempt. In retaliation, President Clinton on June 26th and June 27th, 1993, ordered the USS Peterson, I believe was in the Red Sea, and the USS Chancellorsville was in the Persian Gulf, to launch cruise missile attacks against Iraq, specifically against the headquarters of the Iraqi intelligence service. And so in a move that's actually illegal, President Clinton ordered a cruise missile strike, and as Secretary of Defense Les Aspin stated, he said, and I quote, "What we're doing is sending a message against the people who were responsible for planning this operation. If anybody asks those same people to do it again, they will remember this message." And so Bill Clinton uses foreign affairs to distract from failed domestic policies, and he's willing to use the military in a punitive way. Now remember, his criticisms and what he had said of previous administrators, and Democrats had said of Reagan and Bush, and their use of the military, and how critical they were of those uses, and yet now here is a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, doing the same thing, using that apparatus for his own ends. Success that he enjoyed, even though it was fleeting and he was on his way out of office when it fell apart, were a series of agreements between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and you see Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat meeting in Washington to sign the first of the Oslo Accords. Oslo I would be signed in 1993 in Washington, D.C., and that's what you see there. But these negotiations take place from 1993 through the year 2000 when they all fall apart. And it was designed to legitimize the Palestinian opposition, to grant certain rights like the establishment of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip under Palestinian Authority. In fact, the PLO was replaced by the Palestinian Authority, which gave the Palestinians some say in those regions. So while they're not yet a government, they're at least able to exercise authority over the Palestinians. But where they fell apart were negotiations on moving Israeli settlements, on border disputes, and Jerusalem itself. So although two agreements come out of this, Oslo I in 93 and Oslo II in 95, by 2000 the Oslo Accords fall apart, especially when the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, declares the second intifada, the second uprising against Israel. But no sooner do we have success in Oslo, we have failure in Somalia. October 3rd and 4th, 1993, the United States is again embarrassed when a raid to seize two drug lords in Mogadishu becomes an all-out two-day firefight. They capture two rebel leaders, two followers of Muhammad Farah Aidid. They capture them, but two Black Hawk helicopters are shot down. In the ensuing rescue attempt of the pilots of those helicopters, which you may have seen in the movie Black Hawk Down, the resulting firefight in trying to rescue those pilots ended up in 18 soldiers being killed, 73 wounded, and a pilot captured. Now, the rebels lost some 3,000 fighters, but it made the nation question whether we should be involved in humanitarian relief in Somalia. In fact, the UN itself began questioning and called for a withdrawal of UN forces, and the U.S. soon followed, and by 1995, the United Nations and the United States were out of Mogadishu. Clinton continued to focus on foreign successes in not only following up, and I know I told you the Oslo ultimately failed, but between Oslo I and Oslo II, he's also able to put together an Israel-Jordanian peace treaty, an agreement between Israel and Jordan's King Hussein I. You see him, this handshake is so important. You see, the first of these handshakes that took place was between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the first time that an Arab country had recognized Israel's existence and legitimacy had been Egypt during the Carter administration. Clinton was able to bring the Jordanians and the Israelis together, and so Jordan becomes the second Arab nation to recognize Israel's right to exist, and they worked out trade and peace treaties between the two. But even with those successes in international affairs, the domestic situation led to sweeping Republican wins in 1994. In an unheard of success for a president in his first term, the Republicans were able to take the House of Representatives. And so Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, comes to power. And with that, to get items through Congress, Clinton is pulled from the left more to the center and certainly appears to the nation as a moderate. And in fact, it will be Newt Gingrich and his contract with America that pushes Clinton into tax cuts, spending cuts, and it leads to the prosperity of the 90s. That was certainly piggybacked on the Reagan Revolution, but overcame the Bush recession. So GOP landslide and Newt Gingrich's rise to power brings a transformation of American politics. Clinton also is going to get the United States involved in events in Europe with the Bosnian Wars from 1992 to 1995, but not the United States directly, but acting through NATO, the first of NATO's aggressive actions. NATO was a defensive alliance. So this is the first time that NATO's been used in this way. But as Yugoslavia starts to break apart, the various factions warring amongst themselves, one of the breakaway republics, a Serbian breakaway republic, the president, and you see the president there, Radovan Karadzic, and his republic breaking away, but persecuting the Muslims that live in the area they control, in fact engaging in a number of incidents of genocide, leads in the initial stages of the war to Operation Deny Flight, which prevented the Serbians and the Srpska Republic from using air power against its opposition. And then an Operation Deliberate Force using airstrikes directly against their targets. The first time in history that ground troops were not used by NATO, air power exclusively, to bring about a strategic victory. And so use of Operation Deny Flight and Deliberate Force to put an end to this breakaway republic in Yugoslavia. Further use of the military, Operation Desert Strike. Iraq began radar illuminating American planes, enforcing the north and south no-fly zones, which were preventing the Iraqi Air Force from launching strikes against the Kurds. But Iraqi aircraft and surface-to-air missiles began to paint American planes, meaning their search radars were locking onto the American planes. And so in retaliation for Saddam violating the ceasefire and violating the no-fly zones, the U.S. Carl Vinson aircraft carrier group will launch 27 Tomahawk missiles into Iraq, destroying ground radar, destroying surface-to-air capabilities in preparation, if they continued to do so, for an invasion. Saddam backed down, but once again you see a Democratic president willing to use the military in ways that they had formerly criticized the Republicans for doing. Building upon START 1, President Clinton signs with the world and the United Nations a UN Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first of its kind, revolutionary in its approach. The United States and Russia sign it. Most of the nations of Europe sign it, but there are 8 nuclear powers that are holding out that have yet to sign it. So it's still waiting for those nations to agree to it, that there won't be any nuclear testing in the air, ground, or water. That leads to the election of 1996. In the election of 1996, President Clinton runs for re-election. The economy is doing well. The international affairs appear to be good. Only the international and domestic acts of terrorism are a black eye to the Clinton administration. But the Republicans decide to run an old dog, a Republican Party faithful, Bob Dole. This was my first election to vote in. No, 1992 was my first election to vote in. But I remember going to the polls in 1996 and just being so pissed off at the Republican Party for not giving me a viable choice. I held my nose and voted for Bob Dole and hated myself for doing it. That was while I was still a Republican. Now I'm not. I'm not a Democrat either, so there it is. But in the election of campaign of 1996, the platform is, I'm not Bill Clinton, and it didn't work. The program didn't work, and Bill Clinton won a decisive victory. Now, it certainly wasn't as decisive as in previous years, but it was enough to return him to the White House. So Clinton and his second cabinet, which is very close to his first cabinet, some few changes. No sooner is Clinton back in the White House and back in for his second term, then scandals begin to come hot and heavy. There had been scandals in the first term that were being investigated. The Whitewater scandal in dealing with law firm allegations from the Arkansas years. Upon the Clintons' entry into the White House, FBI files had been called for and taken out of the executive buildings, and those files were found in White House bedrooms. The accusation in the day was that Hillary Clinton had called for files pulled on Republican leaders so that they could dig up dirt to use against them in the campaign. At least that was the allegation. It was lovingly known in the press as Filegate. There had been a scandal about White House travel, how extensively members of the administration had traveled, the lavish way in which they traveled, and so the White House Travel Office scandal, known as Travelgate. And then the independent counsel that Janet Reno had appointed, Kenneth Starr, you see him in the upper left. He's now the president and chancellor of Baylor University. I got an opportunity. He was invited to speak to the Bar Association of Smith County a couple of years ago, and President Mabry, they were holding it on campus, and President Mabry invited me to sit at the head table with President Mabry. But I got to meet Ken Starr. I mean, I don't know that I was a fan. It's just one of those brushes with greatness again. Historians don't get out, so when we get a chance to meet a great person, we do so. I would have been just as excited to go see Hillary Clinton if she had come to speak. But I got to meet and have my picture taken with Kenneth Starr. I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, just so you know. So you owe me one on that, my picture with Ken Starr. But he was already the independent counsel appointed to investigate. And Kenneth Starr was appointed because he's a former Solicitor General. And by the way, Democrats have always bemoaned the fact that he was chosen and that he had engaged in some type of scandalous behavior himself, that he was a dirty old man that just wanted to find a sex scandal so that he could talk about this stuff. He's not that kind of guy. Just in the time I got to spend with you can be a good judge of character, and he's just a nice guy. But he knew this was going to cost him. So he's the former American Solicitor General. That's the American lawyer, that's the government lawyer that argues the administration's cases before the Supreme Court. And most of the Solicitor Generals go on to be justices on the court at some point in the future. He knew when he took this job as an independent counsel that it was ruining his chances to be on the Supreme Court, but he does it anyway. Well, as he's investigating the various scandals, one of those scandals, the Whitewater scandal, leads him to Paula Jones, who was a woman that supposedly had a case against Bill Clinton, that he had seduced her and had sex with her while he was governor of Arkansas. So investigating those reports, evidence was presented to him that there was an ongoing sex scandal in the White House, and that an intern, Monica Lewinsky, you see her picture there, she supposedly had an affair from November of 1995 through March of 1997. And so the news breaks, January 17th, 1998, released on the Drudge Report, Matt Drudge breaking the story. And the Clintons immediately go on defense. And President Clinton's famous, I believe it was 60 Minutes interview, where he promised the American people that he had not had sex with Monica Lewinsky. Well, turns out, as he would later say, it just depends on what your definition of sex is. And I'm not going to go into the sordid details. You can look it up. Just President Clinton had an affair with an intern. But that's not the issue, and it never was the issue. Made blood want to shoot out of my eyes. It's not the fact that the president had sex with somebody who's not his wife. Okay, call me a prude, but I think that's probably pretty bad. What was bad was she was an employee. He is the President of the United States. He is the chief executive. She worked in his government. She worked for the executive branch. She had no more chance, even if she had wanted to, she had no more chance to say no to him than she could fly to the moon. And so to me, it was always about an abuse of power and the misuse of office, not the sex act itself. But as the Lewinsky affair came to dominate domestic affairs, President Clinton became a president on the defensive, and virtually his entire second term is consumed with defense of his actions in the Lewinsky affair. And in fact, the Republican House will vote to impeach Clinton on 2 out of 4 charges, one of those charges being obstruction of justice. But in the trial, and Clinton, by the way, I am using the term properly, he was impeached. The House of Representatives met and voted on articles of impeachment. All that means is they're going to prosecute him on these crimes. That means he's indicted. So he was impeached on December 19th, 1998 on 2 counts. His trial, and the way an impeachment works, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court serves as the judge. The Senate sits as a jury, and chosen House members serve as the prosecution, and then the President, of course, is allowed a defense team. So on January 7th, 1999, the trial begins, and by February 12th, 1999, he was acquitted of the charges. So what that means, proper terminology, President Clinton became the second president impeached. The first president was Andrew Johnson. The second president was Bill Clinton. Richard Nixon resigned before he could be impeached. Remember, the Judicial Affairs Committee were voting on presenting to the House articles of impeachment, and Nixon resigned before it could go to the House. So he was never impeached. He resigned. President Clinton was impeached and acquitted of the charges. Nevertheless, his presidency was for the most part over. He remained a popular president, but he didn't get anything really substantial passed in his last 2 years in office after this happened. But world events continue. And so while all of this is boiling over and we're focused on the president and what he did or didn't do, terror attacks are coming around the world. In a timed attack, Osama bin Laden has truck bombs blow up outside the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, and outside the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania at the same time on August 7th, 1998. Yet again, linked to him. In retaliation, Bill Clinton fires Tomahawk missiles at an area where bin Laden was supposed to have been. Now, intelligence reports later say that they missed him. Bill Clinton blew up an aspirin factory where he was supposed to have been. It was a front for the production of drugs that were then sold for money for the bin Laden operation. But bin Laden has now become a problem to the United States, but he's a problem over there, so it's not really yet fully on the radar of Americans. The attacks on the U.S. embassies and the need for distraction, President Clinton authorizes and uses NATO yet again. The second time NATO's been used to bomb Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, President of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as he persecutes minorities within his state. The air powers of the NATO are used from March through June to bomb strategic targets throughout Kosovo and force Milosevic out of, well, not out of power, but to back off, and then ultimately he is overthrown. So Operation Allied Force, American involvement of Kosovo, yet another policing action. And then finally, the Clinton years, we enter the election cycle on October 12, 2000, with a terrorist attack on a U.S. warship. The USS Cole was anchored, and Al-Qaeda motorboat approached the Cole, I believe it was in Yemen, anchored, and because of the rules of engagement, they didn't stop the ship in time. They didn't shoot the attackers, and so two suicide bombers in a motorboat are able to get right up next to the Cole, and with 700 pounds of explosives, they blow a huge hole in the side of the USS Cole, killing 17 sailors and injuring 39. And so the Clinton years end as they began with a terrorist attack. And increasingly, we see from 1979 to the present, how many times over the last 3 videos have we talked about terrorist actions? All of them have been involving this new organization, Al-Qaeda. All of them have been targeted at U.S. assets, with the exception of the World Trade Center, U.S. assets around the globe. But increasingly, this opponent is seen as an aggressor. And yet still, the United States isn't paying attention. Well, Osama bin Laden's about to get their attention, and it's going to come in such a dramatic fashion that nobody can ignore it. So almost a year after the attack on the Cole, a year and a month after the attack on the USS Cole, is going to come the bombing of the U.S. trade centers on September 11th. But that comes after the next presidential election and will be in the next video.